Everybody, and welcome back. It's been a little while. We had the Maryland Sheep and Wool Festival come through, and I just got a little bit sick. And so my voice was terrible, so I just put off doing this recording for a couple of weeks, but I'm back. And before we get into planting a dye garden, let's talk about what's happening on the farm. So right now it's almost the end of May, which is almost the beginning of summer. Bill has been diligently working to put up a really tall, I would say 8 or 10 foot deer fence around his garden area that will have the tomatoes and the sweet potatoes and all that kind of stuff. And so he's been working on that and planting. Um, and everybody else is doing really great. The sheep and the one goat are out on pasture and eating down um, all the grass that's out there for them. And we have our shearer has brought over about 40 little goat does that are out in the big hayfield, um, because the hay guy never comes until basically it's too late and the hay is terrible. Um, so she is doing intensive grazing, moving around electric fence so that they will eat down the really nice orchard grass, and we have alfalfa out there and stuff like that. So they're getting nice and healthy off of the hayfield. And because it was such a mild winter this winter, we didn't really use any of our hay from last year, and it's still good. Um, and so, we don't really need any hay this year. So I'm really happy to have some animals out there that are eating it down. I think that's really great. So let's get into talking about planting a dye garden. And I guess I need to say, as a disclaimer, um, I'm not really a gardener. I mean, I like to plant things, but I hate weeding. So mostly Bill is the gardener, and even if he is planting dye plants for me, he's still the one that is out there being diligent about the deer fence, like we said, and doing the weeding and all that kind of stuff. It's not fun for me. I don't like it, and he loves it. So there you go. Opposites attract. So the most local dyes you can get would be something that you would either forage, which we have talked about, or things that you grow in your own garden. And there's so many plants that are out there that will offer color. It may not be the best color that you want, but they do offer color, and so it's good to know which colors come from what plants. But before you even get into dyeing your planting your dye garden or planting your dye garden, you kind of need to know some things. So the first thing that's really important is the hardiness zone, and that's kind of it's a big map. There's a website called planthardiness.ars.usda.gov, or you can look up hardiness zones on Google or any other search engine, and you will see the map, and it has the minimum temperatures that it gets throughout the year, um, mapped out on the United States, and I assume that there must be a world one somewhere as well. So if you're listening to this internationally, I'm sure there's a plant hardiness zones for Switzerland and Italy and France and South Africa and Japan. I just don't have the exact websites for those. So there, in the Mid-Atlantic, there are so many zones, and so you have to really look carefully at the map and increase it and make sure of where you are, because you don't want to be putting in tender plants when there might still be some frost coming around. Um, and knowing that those hardiness zones are an accumulation, they are an average over hundreds of years, and you still may have a weird year. Like, last week we had a frost warning. We didn't get down that low. I think we got to like 38 or something, but for May, that is probably pretty low. You can also find those frost dates that will and the length of growing season. I looked these up on the Farmer's Almanac, and you can do that too. You can put in your zip code, and there's lots of websites out there to do that. So here in Frederick, the last frost date is April 7th, but like I just said, we had frost dates that were later than April 7th this year. And the first fall frost is usually November 1st. So on average, there's 207 growing days here. And that can, knowing that information for where you are can really help you decide what plants you can grow within that time period. And, here in Maryland, I've always heard not to plant outdoors until after Mother's Day. But again, there are so many factors and differences between plants. So check out a website like Farmer's Almanac to find that information. So planting your garden, remember, as I've said before, with this natural dying season, you need a lot of plants in order to get a good amount for dye. If you're a new natural dyer or a new gardener, even a small amount can give you enough color to dye some mini skeins. Maybe if you're just trying some things out, you don't know how they'll work in your garden, with your soil, with the rainfall and the temperatures that are in your area. Even planting a small number of plants, you can get enough color to dye some mini skeins. And then you can make a striped hat or a cowl or a scarf or something like that. That will be like, hey, I grew this color. And, maybe if you're a spinner and you have spun those mini skeins, that would even be really fantastic as well. It's important to know the growth habits of the plants that you're interested in. Are they perennials? Are they annuals? Do they have a 1 season or 2 season growth cycle? Can they be invasive? And where you plant those plants should be dictated by what kind of plant they are. For instance, I know that weld, which gives a really beautiful yellow color and it's really easy to grow, has a 2-season growth cycle. So you just have to know those things and plan accordingly and put them in places where they will be protected throughout your winter season. So here's some plants that you can grow and the colors that they will give you. For yellows, so like I just mentioned, weld it's a beautiful, sunny, bright yellow. Marigolds and zinnias will give you gold colors, as will yarrow and tansy. There are so many plants that will give you yellows. So just experimenting with those will always be good. If you get tired of yellow, well, remember, as I've talked about before, you can always over dye with another color. You can over dye with a red or an orange to change that color, or even dip it into an iron bath to make it verge towards a green-gray kind of a color. So even though there's lots of yellows that you can grow, those can be shifted into other colors to make more of a rainbow. For some of the gold colors, safflowers, that's a beautiful plant. Cosmos, there's a Dyer's Coreopsis. Dahlias make a beautiful orange, and St. John's wort makes a beautiful orange. So some of these things, like a dahlia or daffodils, make a yellow. That they may be already in your garden, and you're just going to be saving those flower heads. And colors that you can grow that are oranges or reds. So madder will do that. Sumac will do that, which is really more of a wild plant. Rhubarb root will do that, and pear leaves will do that. And greens, colors that you can grow that are greens. I was very surprised. Purple plum leaves will give you green. It leaves the purple dye in the pot, but the But the green underneath that will actually strike your wool skeins, which is kind of cool. And ivy will give you some greens too. Of course, you can always again over dye some of your yellows with indigo, and that will make it green. But these are just colors that you can grow that will give you that color in the first place. And then your blues and purples. These are a little bit harder to achieve and take a little bit more time, like indigo and woad. Woad is a kind. It works in a similar manner to indigo, but was grown in Europe before indigo made it to Europe. Hopi sunflowers make a really neat kind of a gray purple. Hollyhocks, Dyer's alkanet, and rose mallows will give you blues and purples. So you're growing all this stuff, and then what do? Well, you need to collect the dye stuffs, and depending again on how much you have, you can use it right away. You can make your dye liquor right away, and you can, if you're not ready to dye at that time, you can save it, or you can use it now and then save the exhaust and save that later for later use. You can dry the flower heads. That's what I used this year for my marigold dyeing. I used flowers that had been collected by a friend, and she dried them, and they worked just perfectly dried. You can also freeze them, so you can pick off the flowers, freeze them, and put them in a Ziploc bag and put them in your freezer. And the other thing you could do is, if you do make that dye liquor, is that you could make a lake pigment, which I think I'll spend some time talking about in another podcast. But basically what happens is through a series of chemical reactions, you pull all the dye pigment into precipitant on the bottom of a jar, and then you let that dry, and it becomes a pigment that then you can make into ink, you can make into watercolors, you can make into tempera or oil paints, and you can put them back into water and make them dye again. So even again, if you are doing a small amount and you think, okay, I'll store what I harvested this year, and then next year I'll combine what I have and I'll have a better dye pot. So just think about those things and go ahead and harvest and store them and use them, because that's the fun part. Even if it's just a little bit, it's the fun part, it's the magic of dyeing. There's so many good resources out there about harvesting and planting and finding dye colors. Rita Buchanan has a great book called Dyer's Garden. She also has a companion book that's called Weaver's Garden, and that one includes planting linen, flax, and also planting cotton. And if you hear some panting, Lucas just had to come in and say hello. Jenny Dean's book, Wild Color, is one of my favorites. And again, it will tell you how to cultivate. It will tell you how and when to harvest. It is a great, it's a great resource. It's a little paperback, and it has the colors in there that you should get, whether you're using an alum mordant, using an iron afterbath, all of those things. And the Chesapeake Fiber Shed Natural Dyers Journal has some great essays in there about dyes that are grown here, dyes that are foraged. The writing was done by Kirsten Zerbreg, who's been on the podcast as a guest before, and she just writes so beautifully. She writes about the medicinal properties. I couldn't think of the word. Medicinal properties of some of these dye plants, about the dyes themselves, about the history, about the plants, about growing them. It's just a really great place if you're interested in natural dyeing to look and see what she has written there. And then on my website, I have a page called free resources or free learning resources. And you can get to that on the website. And there's lots of PDFs in there that have like my favorite 10 natural dye books and all that kind of stuff with links. So it's easy for you to get to and through Amazon. So there's a list of good resources. So my dye highlight of this episode is madder. And this is a plant that you can grow, and I have it growing. I think I bought 2 seedlings. I think it was only 2. Oh my gosh. So you need to be very careful with this plant. It is very invasive. I planted it in raised boxes. But the roots have gone under the boxes and are now growing in other parts of the garden. The dye is found in the roots. It makes a lovely, many different shades of orange and red, depending on the other modifiers that you use. The roots need to grow 2 or 3 years before you harvest them. Um, and funny story is that I am tired of this plant, and like I said, it's very invasive. So I asked our landscaping help guy, Chuck, to can you come and dig up these 2 plants, dig them up, dig them all up, and then I would have all the roots that I could possibly need for probably forever. So he came and did that, and I got the roots, and the next season, didn't they grow back? So he's going to have to come again pretty soon. This dye is a dye that also loves extra minerals. So a lot of times to get good coverage on your yarn, you need to add chalk into the dye pot. But also I read that it loves having extra sand and extra kind of chalky materials in the dirt as well. So that would be something that you might want to consider when you are planting it. And my advice to you would be to put it in a pot, because then plant one in a pot, a big pot, let it grow for 2 years. You can control that, pull it all up. You can save one root, or you can do them in. You could do them in series, like plant a pot this year, plant a pot next year, plant a pot the next year, and then you can kind of rotate them through. That would be my advice for this plant. And our farm yarn highlight is LiViLy Bounce. So this is made from our Cormo wool, and that's why it's called LiViLy. Again, if you haven't listened to these before, I named my Cormo wool LiViLy because my 2 foundation ewes were Lily and Viola, and so it was kind of mushing those 2 words together. This is a sport weight yarn. It's 2-ply. I called it Bounce because it is really elastic. It is really a beautiful yarn. It has great stitch definition. It has a lovely twist in the ply, and it takes color beautifully. Each skein is 330 yards in the 4 ounces that the skein is. And again, it's called LiViLy Bounce. It's on the website. It's relatively new, so there's only limited colorways right now. We will be dyeing more of it because I have a gracious plenty of it. So take a look at it either here in person during our open studios or at a show or even online. So until next time, happy making.